In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to paint this really pretty apple blossom in watercolour with easy to follow steps using a really limited palette. After taping down my paper onto my watercolour board like this to stop it from buckling, I've done a really simple line drawing, and I'll put the line drawing and the reference photograph in the Facebook group. A really limited palette today of Permanent Rose, Cadmium Yellow, Sap Green, Sepia and Paynes Grey, and I'll put all the details in the description box underneath this video. Don't worry if you haven't painted before, I'm going to show you an easy to follow steps. So to begin with, you'll need to mix a bright pink colour. I'm using Permanent Rose with a tiny bit of Cadmium Yellow. Just use whatever colours that you have that are nearest to the colours that I choose. To begin with, the washes need to be really watery. That means that they have more water than pigment. You can see me here begin to apply the paint to one of the petals using my number 3 size spotter brush. All the materials I'm going to use for this tutorial I'll put in the description box below, but just use, as I keep saying, the nearest that you have. Once you've applied a watery mix of paint to the petal, use a damp brush to blend it into the paper. This will mean that it has no hard edges, and you can see me here dropping in the second mix on top of the already damp pink petal. This means it will just give it a really natural blur, and using the tip of my brush to merge these two colours together like this. And continuing the process, dipping between the two mixes within my palette. Staying close to the pencil line, patting my brush on a kitchen towel and then just blending it in like this. It gives it a really soft edge, it makes it look really natural. I'm using really subtle tones for these really pretty apple blossoms. You don't want strong colours here. I recommend that you watch this video all the way through so you can see the entire watercolour process, particularly so if you're new to watercolour painting, as it can look a little disjointed halfway through. So be sure that you stay until the end and watch it all come together. For this tutorial, I've used mixed media paper and not watercolour paper, and I'll explain why a little later. Outline, which I don't particularly like, so just blend it in using a damp brush. I'm just patting the paint into the paper like this, again to soften the edges. And I'll just continue this process until all the flower heads and the buds are completed with this first initial wash. It's really important when painting this way that the line drawing at the beginning isn't sketchy. You want to have a really nice, clean, crisp edge, which is why I provide you with the traceables, so you can print them off and just trace down the drawing yourself if you don't like drawing. It can take quite a bit of time, and sometimes you'd like to get on with the painting, which is why I give you the traceables. I'm not applying this colour to the entire petal. You can see that I'm leaving a little bit of gap here and there just to give it a sense of realism. If you look at the flowers in real life, you'll see that there isn't a colour that's all over. It will have sort of undulations and little gaps here and there. So it's important that we replicate this within our painting. So don't apply the paint everywhere. I'm using a number 6 size spotter here just to do a overall water glaze, by which I mean I'm just adding water to the brush and painting over it really lightly to merge these colours together and get rid of the hard edges. Use whichever largest brush that you have. Now that the paint is dry, we can have a look at the stalk, the woody barky stalk that's on here, and I'm mixing a really watery mix of Paynes grey and sepia. They have to be really watery for this initial wash, and I'm applying sepia on this right hand side and I'll apply Paynes grey on the opposite side and then gently merge them together. And this is the Paynes grey going on now. And just using a damp brush to merge these two together. I want to try and keep the little highlight that's running down the centre of the stalk, but it doesn't matter if you don't do it, we can lift it out a bit later. It just gives the illusion of that barky, woody tree bark being a little bit more curved. And just blending it in, and on the little stubby barky bit on the top of that flower head there. And just merging it together. Just outlining some detail here. I'm also using this colour to go in between some of the buds and the flowers because it's difficult to figure out what's going on there, so I just added this for some contrast. When you're painting around small areas like this, you may find it easier if you just pat your brush like this rather than just trying to paint it on. By dabbing your brush in between these little areas, you'll find the application is so much easier. You'll also notice that the paint on my palette has dried up a little bit. It just means that you have full control of the paint. If you were to try and paint smaller areas with a weak wash, it simply wouldn't work. You need to have it a little bit drier so that you have that control. And just applying a bit more detail to the woody bark area here, just by using the same two mixes that I have on my palette. So we have sepia and Paynes grey, and just going over the paint that we've already applied, giving it another layer and more tonal contrast and tonal variation. You can see me, I'm just using the brush in a kind of circling, wiggling motion to give it a little bit of texture. And lifting out that central highlight. I'm just using a damp brush to lift out some circles within the bark, by just wiggling the brush into the paper and patting it dry with some kitchen roll, just lifts out these little circles, ready to add some detail around a bit later. Dry, we can focus on the two small leaves at the top of the picture here. I'm mixing a watery mix of Sap Green and applying it all over both of the leaves. We're going to be building around this a little bit later with some negative painting, which means we're going to be painting around that central vein in a slightly darker green colour. I'm adding a little bit of sepia and a tiny bit of Paynes grey to the Sap Green to darken the colour up so that we can start to apply it to the leaf that's underneath, and just to give it a little bit of form and some shape. I'm just adding another little puddle of Sap Green here. And you can see how I'm blending it into the existing wash. The underlying wash has to be dry, otherwise your colours will just blurge together. So make sure that your layers are dry before you apply another layer of paint on top of it. On this top leaf here, you can see me using the darker green mix to go around that central vein there. This is negative painting, where we are creating a shape and just blend it in as always. So just using a damp brush to merge those colours together like this. And you can see how easy these colours blend together. Okay, so I've cleaned down my palette and you can see me adding 3 droplets of water here, mixing a bit of Sap Green with Cadmium Yellow. And you can see how watery this needs to be. We are going to be applying this over some of the petals, just adding a bit more green there. And the same mix here with a tiny bit of permanent rose and permanent rose on the bottom petal right there. And just adding a tiny bit more cadmium yellow. You can see me adding a bit more, I think it's a little bit more sap green and a bit more of the yellow colour, and applying it to the centre like this. If you are struggling with watercolour painting, and I know it can be a tricky medium to handle, hopefully this video will simplify the process. And remember, it is all about having fun with watercolour. I'm just adding a little bit more cadmium yellow to around the bud here and the base of some of the larger buds. But make sure that you blend it as always. You can see me adding this darker mix here and just pulling out the beginnings of some of the veining that you might see within the flower head. Just gently pulling up some shapes. Just putting in some shapes. and just really play around with it to give that sense of realism and joy. And once you've learned how to handle the medium, I promise you, you will fall in love with it as much as I have. You can see me here adding the permanent rose mix and the cadmium yellow permanent rose mix to the base of this little bud. I've added a tiny bit of sap green to the red mix because it was just a little bit too bright, just to give it a sense of realism. By the way, if you're enjoying this tutorial and would like to learn how to paint botanicals in more detail, then head over to our Patreon site where you can, for around £9 a month, get a brand new tutorial in further detail, details of which will be in the description box below. Now I'm using the tip of my brush to paint in some veins on the petals. When you're painting veins on petals, make sure that the colour of your paint is correct. You don't want a darker colour where it should be lighter. You want the lighter part of the vein where the light is hitting the petal to be more diluted to make it look natural. So where your light is, add a little bit more water, and where your dark is, go in stronger. I hope that makes sense. Maybe I can demonstrate it better while I'm painting. On my palette I've mixed a really watery mix of sepia and Paynes grey, and I'm applying it to some of the areas within the buds and the petals just to give a little bit of shadow. At the moment it's looking a little bit too flat, so I'm just adding it here and there to add a little bit of shape and form, and then blending it in with my brush like this. So just apply the colour where you can see this darker shade within the photograph, or where the plant naturally kind of curves in on itself, you can see, just to give it a bit of shadow and a bit of realism. Don't have the colour too strong within your palette, it just won't look right. It really needs to be a watery mix. And you can see just by adding this really watery mix of the shadow area, it just makes this plant jump to life. As long as you blend those colours in. Just applying the same mix to the filament, sort of the anther, isn't it? The little bit. Just dotting that on with a small brush. This is just the mixture of sepia and Paynes grey. Just quickly popping that in. And just applying it to the base of that flower. This is a slightly thicker mix, and just going over the darker colours that we applied earlier with the same colour but in a thicker consistency to add some detail. And going back to the stalk or the bark, just outlining some of the areas we've already applied, just going over it and adding some texture. Just using a pattern motion to create texture here. And you can see those little bits that we've lifted out earlier, just sort of circling around some of them to make them look real. You can see how dry the paint is on my palette here. It just makes it very, very easy to paint in these tiny little areas. Just painting down some of the filament with the very weak wash of Permanent Rose, and I think this is the colour that had a tiny bit of cadmium yellow in it, and you can see me once again flitting back to the Permanent Rose, but it's very, very watery. And now just going over some of the colours and enhancing them as I found it necessary. The colours need to be subtle but also strong enough to give shape and form. And now I'm putting in the veins, and remember when you hit the lighter area to add a little of water to make it more realistic. So the darker colour of the vein needs to be towards the base where it's in shadow and lighter towards the lighter part. Otherwise your veins will look unrealistic. And now I'm applying the darker colour to the anther. Using a really steady hand and a number 0 size spotter just to go and add a little bit of detail to each of these in turn. I really need to start to learn the names of the parts of the plant. As a botanical artist, I should know. And just carry on adding this detail and repeating the process until your painting is completed. You can see I'm just enhancing some of the pink tones and some of the yellow tones by a really gentle glaze of both of these colours on each of the petals to really start to bring it to life. And so it really is a case of continuing this process until it's finished.